Hi, this is Stephen from the United States, also known as Radical Liberation. And I have with me Jack.
Hello.
In what way do you identify where you're from?
So I'm from the UK.
From the UK.
Yeah, sure. I think most people know.
Right. Okay. So obviously, well, I'm just trying to think if there's anything we want to touch on before getting to our main topic. I often, Jack, just, mention some other thing that's on my mind. Well, first of all, Mad Mercenary's not here, and he was kind enough to find a substitute and arrange for Jack to join us, which I really appreciate him doing that. And then I was on a stream with Jack and Academic Agent recently. And so I know that Jack is capable, and in fact, on this topic, I would say way more capable than I'm going to be. But I am interested in the topic, so hopefully I can provide enthusiasm, if nothing else. So as far as I know, it's just this show, and Mad Mercenary will rejoin us next time. So what's on my mind here with this topic? What's on my mind is that people are talking very seriously about being hostile to China in various ways. I'm interested in that from sort of a foreign policy, war and peace kind of focus, but that's not what this show's about. Another way to express your hostility is trade wars and things like that. And I don't know if this is, I don't want to be unfair. I don't think it's all about, just like getting it on with China. There's also, I would say legitimate concerns that people have about feeling vulnerable after the current crisis, right? There were concerns that medicine, I think somebody said penicillin is only available from China, right? I don't know if that's true.
I don't know about penicillin specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Right. Whether that's 100% penicillin from China, I don't know. But certainly they're big into manufacture pharmaceuticals. And so that's been a touchy area, obviously, right now with the coronavirus scare. So there's been concerns about that. And then what were you talking about? Strategic resources or something?
Yeah, so with regards to China, they make up 70% of the entire global supply of critical raw materials. And so this is stuff
what does
like,
that mean?
These are the raw materials that are some of the most basic and most used. So an example would be certain rare earth elements, for example, magnesium, where the European Union specifically gets almost all of their supply from China. And so they absolutely dominate in this field.
Right. So that would be another concern. And I guess the concern is that, what is the concern, Jack? Trying to Steelman are what's being raised here. What is the concern as legitimately as you can state it?
Right. So, to keep it very current, it was about 4 days ago that this story in particular exploded. We saw loads of articles all over the place. And the reason for that is that the Trump administration was very public about their thoughts about restarting this trade war with China because of how they perceive the supply chains to have reacted poorly to this coronavirus issue. And I guess when we go into the stream, we can talk about whether or not this current economic crisis was down to that. And I personally don't think it was, but I guess we can go into that later. But the concern from a lot of people is the idea that because China is such a huge exporter of so many goods, that as soon as their economy tanks, everyone in the world panics, no one knows how to respond. And so there's people around the world saying we're relying too much on China, which is a country that we can't really trust because they've been known to lie with their data, especially with this virus. And so there are calls by many Western countries, such as the US, to maybe cut them out and only trade with people that they can trust.
Right. So so one cause here would be, well, it's all intertwined, right? One issue is that China is viewed as the source of the coronavirus. That's widely believed, though I've seen some recent data that suggests that the coronavirus was around prior to it being noticed in China from France. So that's interesting. But leave that aside for the moment. The general belief is that this came from China, and therefore China bad because they meant to, or they accidentally did it, or whatever. So there's that. But separate from that issue, I think, is that when China went into lockdown and stopped some of its factories, the world felt it. Is that fair to say, Jack?
Yeah. And also, you see the responses of different countries. And one of the arguments that people who are in favor of cutting China out like to mention is the fact that there are countries, particularly in Asia, such as Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, that due to their foreign relations with China, which aren't so positive to say the least, reacted very quickly. And as a result, they weren't hit as badly as a lot of other countries around the world, both in terms of the virus and in terms of economics. And so their argument is, well, maybe we should follow after their example, and in the future, we should slowly cut China out.
Wait, I'm sorry. So what's an example of a country that reacted quickly?
So Taiwan, which I think is
South Korea, was that another?
Yeah. A lot of these Asian countries that are quite hostile in their foreign relations with China due to them being the big power in the region.
So essentially, for other reasons, they reacted in a kind of a different way to China than maybe some others did. And they actually, and it's argued they benefited from that. So, hey, if we could just all be as hostile to China as people who have bad memories of Chinese domination or whatever, then we'd all be better off. That's essentially the argument, right?
That's basically what they're saying, yeah. And also, you look at other instances around the world where there's other areas that dominate with trade that you've seen similar effects. For example, around, I think it was October, November of last year, there were attacks on these oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, which everyone blamed on Iran, even though they denied it. The consensus is that it was Iran launching drone strikes, and the result of this was that for several weeks the whole oil economy went into real shock, and millions of dollars were lost. And so it's a very, you see a lot of parallels with this, and also the arguments about these.
Not hearing you for a moment, Jack.
Strait of Hormuz and the limitations on oil supply. It's basically
Jack, your audio's going in and out suddenly. It was perfectly great until 20 seconds ago or something.
Oh, sorry. Is it better now?
Yes, now I can hear you.
I can't really tell. Okay.
What's going on? Okay.
So but basically what I was saying was that this isn't an issue that's specifically related to China. It's an issue that can be seen with these same groups of people with any part of the world where a single country is able to dominate a particular resource or cut off a trade route. And so China's the big topic, but you can use this argument in almost any sphere.
Right. So, this is going back to my childhood, but OPEC,
right,
controlling the oil market, right, would be in a way a parallel. I guess what makes it more frightening for people with China is that it isn't one. Oil was pretty scary by itself because we all knew how important oil was to our economy, but what maybe makes it scary with China is that our whole lives, certainly my whole life, we've been seeing made in China on everything.
Yeah.
And so it isn't just one thing. It feels like everything. It's all coming from China. And if they have problems, then how much does it affect? Medicine, computers? I mean, what doesn't it affect almost, right?
Right. And China's the industrial heart of the world. I mean, I believe they're by a long way the biggest exporters of goods. And so this is, of course, why people were concerned, which I guess with this in mind, it's worth bringing up the counter side to this, which a lot of these people aren't considering, which is the fact that China is also one of the biggest importers of goods in the world.
Right. So shall we bring something up on that? The second article, China feeding its population one, right?
Yeah, we can go with the food.
Yeah, let's bring that up. That I found that very interesting when you mentioned it. Okay, how is China feeding its population? Okay, so this is the article, and maybe that first circular kind of thing would be the one to have on the screen, right?
Yeah. Well,
so this is vegetables.
We can try to use it. I think it's when you have to hover over.
So rest of the world's export to rest of the world. Oh, I see.
Basically, to explain the issue with food imports to everyone, China, we all have in this image that China is this massive country with lots of rural areas that they're able to produce lots of food, but that's not the reality. In reality, they have an extremely low amount of fertile or arable land that they're able to use. The figure that I was told by a guy called Alexei Maslov, who's an expert on the subject, was that it was around 8% of all of their land was actually arable. We have a map which we're not really sure about, and obviously China's not known for its accurate data, so keep that with a pinch of salt. But either way, we do know that China doesn't have the land to sustain a population as large as they do have on their own. Plus,
right, and so real quick before we leave land, strictly speaking, part of the thing that's confusing there is, you look on the globe or on a world map, and it looks really big. So how could it have such a problem with arable land? And my simplistic explanation, I don't know if you've heard anything better, is it's got a lot of mountains and desert. And so there's plenty of square miles in China, but a lot of them, it sounds like the great majority of them are not suitable for farming. But it doesn't stop there, as you were pointing out. A lot of that area is not so suitable for people either, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Basically, all of Chinese population. I mean, a massive percentage. I can't remember the exact percentage. It's something like 80% of them are all in the east on the coast. And so there are huge swathes of land that just have almost no people on, which means that obviously it's not being used for farming, even if it was good for farming. And so as a result, this combined with their huge population means that they simply cannot produce on their own the food to sustain their population. And so as a result, they're extremely reliant on food imports. The United States in particular is the country that provides the most imports of food to China. I think it's a two-way relationship in that China's biggest partner when it comes to food is the US, and also the US biggest partner in exporting food is China. And so this is a factor against cutting China out of a global supply, is that this would very much harm US agricultural industries, because China is such a huge market due to their sheer population. Millions and millions of dollars would be lost.
Right. So I think I might have figured out how to work this thing on the fly. So what I focused on here is this is the vegetable export. It says that China, as we expected, exports $1.5 billion of vegetable products to the U.S., but the USA exports nearly $18 billion of vegetable products to China. So that illustrates Jack's point, right?
Yeah.
That we have tended to be focused, because of the way people are in politics, we have tended to be focused on China's exports, but we haven't been focused on the flip side, which is China's imports, which means business that other countries like the United States, the UK, business that is being done where China's the customer. So we start cutting things off with China, and it can mean that suddenly, our uncle is losing his job, because it turns out that what he was doing, a big part of his customer base were the Chinese, right?
Yep.
That's part of the problem there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, food is a big one, mainly because China is so reliant on food, and also because it's the US big export, and we're talking about the US-China relations here, basically. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's so many other supplies: copper, cement, steel. All of these, China makes up, I think, roughly 50% of the entire global market, importing just these goods, which is a colossal figure. And so you think of all of the producers of these goods from Germany, from the US, all these places, they're going to lose a huge market if they cut China out. So there's serious costs straight off the bat.
Yeah, I'm trying to think how to think about that, because one of the mental experiments I wanted us to do today is to let's go extreme with it, and let's imagine that, the world imposes a great wall around China, right?
Yes.
Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. What does the world look like after such a thing is done? Now, I don't think anyone's really proposing that, but by thinking about that, it helps us think about things that are asymptotically approaching such a situation, right?
Yeah.
I think that the picture people have in their mind is, well, we'll just go back to manufacturing our own iPhones or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Apple will have to make iPhones, not necessarily in the United States, but somewhere besides China, right? Maybe maybe India. India is another rising economy that I guess people aren't having the bad feelings towards that they're having towards China. So maybe India will start making iPhones or something like that. And so what's the big deal? But I think this starts to paint a picture of what a big deal it would be, right? Because I think the point you're making is a number of industries that could lose half their business or something, because if China's behind that imaginary wall, right?
Yeah, and it's let's say we were to enclose China in a wall here. It's more than they just lose money. It's also, it would seriously reallocate people's jobs around the global market. Is it part of the benefit? And this is going into the kind of theory behind it a lot. Part of the benefit of free trade is that it allows countries to specialize. But the moment you cut a block out, it suddenly means that people are going to have to leave their specialized job and filter into so many more other jobs just to sustain that loss of industries that they've been brought in. And so it would, if you were to do this very suddenly, which, I mean, I don't know what we're proposing here, whether it be something immediate or something gradual, but
imagine magic.
Right. So just magically overnight, this suddenly happened. Right. I mean, the costs of people having to shift their employment alone to other industries and having to be retrained, and all of the job hunting that would be going on, or that alone would cripple economies.
Right. So agriculture in this particular picture, U.S. agriculture could take a hit such that people are actually shifted out of agriculture.
Right.
Because the U.S. agriculture was feeding itself, feeding America and feeding China, say, to make it simplistic. And now it's just feeding America. And suddenly farmers are thrown out of work and they got to figure out what else to do, right? And but continue through not just in agriculture, but across various sectors of the economy.
Yeah, and so as well as the cost of simply people being forced to move jobs, there's also the cost of efficiency. And this is the big opportunity cost, because it means that you're trading an extremely efficient, extremely specialized country that's good at producing your iPhone or whatever for a local industry that's going to produce your iPhone, but they're going to waste far more materials because they're not as specialized in it. They've got a much smaller form of economies of scale. There's less competition, which means there's less incentive for them to get good at this on a real macro level. And of course, the costs for these things are going to be high. So.
Right. Yeah, I was imagining to myself, I'm an Apple guy, so I think about Apple products, right? And so I was imagining, maybe the iPhone price wouldn't double if they were no longer using China for assembly. Right, because it famously on the Apple devices says designed in California, assembled in China, something like that.
Yeah.
If they couldn't use China for assembly, maybe the iPhone wouldn't double, but maybe it'd be 150%. About half again as expensive. I don't think that's a crazy thing to propose, as you think about it.
And it's the whole supply chain involved with it would be altered, right? Because they'd be paying different amounts for the materials. Because there's with a whole country, it's not like you're blocking off a single industry, which of course would be damaging enough as it is. But it's every single chain, both importing and exporting to that country, and so every industry that is involved with those materials or those commodities are themselves going to be impacted. So you can just imagine the ripple effect through the whole economy with this. I mean, it would be seriously damaging.
Right, and I tell me if you think I'm abusing an Austrian way of thinking here, but we talk about as an economy advances, it moves to higher orders of production, right? Mm-hmm. More roundabout means of production. So when I hear people say shorten the supply chain, what I hear is regress in a sense, right? Draw back from a more roundabout method of production and go back to a shorter method of production, which is going to be less efficient and more costly. Is that a fair thing to hear? Shorten supply chain and think in my head as an Austrian, less roundabout means of production?
Yeah, I think that the fundamental thing that would be caused would be, I'm going to throw in another economic term here, artificial scarcity, because you are creating a scarcity of commodities and of price-based commodities, because you're essentially, I mean, let's take borders and politics out of the question. It's essentially just different regions that are producing different things. And so cutting off access to a whole region is going to create a scarcity that is artificial because it's not a natural market-based phenomenon. And so you can see the obvious costs with this. And I mean, this is the exact argument we give on the Austrian side of things against regulation, in that regulation artificially incurs higher costs because it creates artificial scarcity. And that in turn reduces competition in a market, which increases the likelihood of monopolies being formed. And so you can see how this is just a really large version of these basic economic functions.
We've had an interesting discussion going with Academic Agent on this topic.
Yeah.
And he said, let's go back to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith talked about the division of labor being key to rising productivity. And so what does it mean to shorten supply chains? It means to reduce the division of labor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the extent of the market, the extent of the producers, I guess, that are participating in the division of labor, that is sort of your upper bound on how much you can divide your labor. As you lower that number of producers that are involved, then you reduce your division of labor, which directly goes to what we think of as, an advanced economy, right? We're essentially primitivizing our economy, so to speak. We're going the other direction from what we're used to.
Yeah, and AA's whole argument, to stick with this, he acknowledges all of these costs, because for those who didn't see AA's recent stream, go watch it on his Unpopular Opinions. Basically, he argues that this should happen. He says that, but not just China. AA is arguing that countries should basically restrict all trade outside of goods that they can't get domestically. And then within borders have this kind of classical liberal free trade market. My issue with AA's logic of thinking is that why would he apply the argument? Because I had a long discussion with him last night on the Deep Law on Discord, and he said that he basically didn't like the fact that consumers were going and buying cheaper goods from China and whatever. And so he said on their behalf, for their good, he wanted to impose these restrictions. But what I don't understand is why he can apply this argument on an international level, but not a domestic level. because this is the exact same argument that many people who are advocating for central planning domestically use, that they should impose regulations because they know better than the consumers what they should or should not be buying.
I didn't know where you were going. I thought you were going to say, why not down to the village level, Why,
Yeah.
why should Scotland trade with England? Why should the village down the street trade with the village up the street in England, or whatever, right? How far do we take it? But anyway, you went in a different direction. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, we may return to that. And in fact, Jack, I don't know how much you know the structure of the show here, but I try to actually get sort of our main stuff out there in the first half-ish, maybe a little more than half, and then have lots of time to respond to questions and stuff like that. In fact, Academic Agent, I notice, is in the chat. So,
Yes.
So let's see. We have another, or which article would you think I ought to look at? Pull up next. The first one or the third one?
I guess we'll go with... Should we go with the third one, because we've already mentioned it, so we could wrap that up? That's the one on the commodities.
Right.
So we can just quickly go over it and go, look, this visually shows what we're saying, and then we can move on to the first one.
China's staggering... Oh, great. This is good. We should have had this up. This is great. China's staggering demand for commodities. So this is
these are
pulling
goods
commodities
and these are goods that China imports.
Okay, yeah, okay. I was going to say so they can manufacture, but that's not totally what we're seeing here. To some degree, these are agricultural products. They're pulling stuff in so they can eat.
You see that. And
sort of the bottom row, right? And then in the top, you see things that they're pulling in part, of course, for their domestic economy, but some of this would be so that they can produce manufactured goods that are then exported again, right?
Right, yeah. It's a lot of it because of their industrial economy. But I really like to point at these percentages and make sure everyone in the chat realizes that these percentages are how much of the global demand there is. So this isn't some micro domestic percentage. This is the entire world's demand. China alone makes 59% of the global demand for cement, which is a colossal amount, right? and so you just think of the cost of cutting this out, and all of the industries around the world that would suffer. I mean,
and just to get the population figures back in our head here to put some scale on this, China is huge from a population perspective, but it is not 59% of the population of the world. What's a rough thing here? It's like, isn't it about 2 billion out of 7, or am I
something like that? Yeah.
It's something like that. And what's 2 over 7? I can't do it in my head. 2 over 8 would be 25%. So 2 over 7 would be, sorry, I need to use a calculator.
Well, it's nowhere near 60%.
About 30%. Wow, that's amazing. Is that true? Jeez, that is a huge amount. Right, but so they're, for half of the commodities, I'm sorry, more than half. For over half of the commodities listed here, cement, aluminum, nickel, coal, copper, steel, pork, and cotton, and rice, they are exporting more than just their percentage of the global population, right? Like you could see it, China's got a lot of people, so sure, they're going to import around 1/3 or 28% or whatever of these things. But a lot of these things are way over that, like cement and aluminum. You're getting close to doubling that, because it's not all for them. I mean, I think that's part of the reason. And then I don't know how much, like when I see cement, they're not importing cement and then exporting something again, I wouldn't think. I don't know.
Yeah, it's probably used for the big infrastructural projects and things.
Right. It's that may be a little something like cement, maybe just because the phase China is in, where they're in a growth phase and an industrialization phase and a build out phase. Some of which, as we've discussed on a previous stream, is probably a bit of a bubble. They're building buildings that are not being occupied, right? Yeah. So some of it's a little bit absurd and wasteful. But we also know that they are genuinely productive and importing stuff and importing raw materials and exporting manufactured goods. Okay, that's mostly what we wanted to get from that article, right? Yes.
Yeah. And I guess it's not directly
So
related.
yeah, staggering demand is for once it's not hyperbole. I mean, think about it for a moment. How much they're pulling in, given their percentage of the world's population. It's really a stunner. Okay, now shall we switch to the other? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll do that. Well, one of the things I do find really interesting about this is that relative to these other commodities, because obviously it's still a colossal amount, but relative to the other commodities, oil is quite low on their imports. And obviously, I mean, as far as I'm aware, China isn't a particularly oil-rich country. So that's an interesting one.
Wait, I'm sorry. Say that point one more time. I lost it.
Oil is quite low down on their list. I mean, obviously, these are their biggest.
Why is that? I am surprised by that. Why is that?
I'm not sure. You'd need to ask someone who's an expert on China oil.
They're not a big oil producer, are they? I'd never heard of China as being a big oil producer.
I don't think so. It's a really odd one, but
yeah, it could. Just throwing out a theory, it could be that they are a great big oil producer, but not enough to export. It's enough for them to, to meet mostly their own demand, and just need a little bit from the rest of the world, relatively speaking. Unlike, when we think about oil producers, we're thinking about people who are huge exporters, right? They're producing a lot more oil than they need to use themselves. I mean, maybe that's part of the reason why the Middle East looms so large in these stories, is you've got these really small populations in Abu Dhabi and places like this, right? And they're getting a ton of oil out of the ground, and they don't have a huge population with a huge industrialized civilization there. It's really like, it's mostly going to export. So the United States actually is a big generator of oil, but we use a lot of it as well, right? Yeah. So you don't think of the United States in the same category in your mind as, an OPEC nation, even though we are a massive oil producer.
People in the chat are saying that China uses a lot of coal, and also that China is a very large oil producers. So
they do produce a lot of oil as well. Okay. Now, do you want to go to the other final article you had sent me?
Yeah. We'll go to that article.
And then just say this out loud so I don't forget. I do want to say something about the Chi-Com thing, but not quite yet. Okay, so right. So when I'll confess, Jack, the focus on trade deficits, based on my learning of Austrian economics and just economics in general, it's never made a lot of sense to me. Yep. So I tend to get lost on things like this. So go slowly with me what you want to bring up here. Oh, and I guess I could just put that graph on the screen, right?
Yeah, we'll go with the graph. Basically what this graph is showing is the relation between current account deficits, so trade deficits, the level of imports relative to exports, and also the other line is budget deficits. So the budget balance of this is the US. And this is the twin deficit hypothesis, which is what I explained at the end of the MMT stream. And so basically the reason why I'm bringing up this article is, if we were to think about ways that a trade war could be launched on China, the most obvious one that you would put forward is through tariffs, right? And part of the argument I have against this is with this article, which is that the US has done this in recent years. And rather than them decreasing their current accounts, their trade deficit, they've actually increased it. So despite putting up tariffs, they've exported even more relative to how much they've imported.
Right.
Sorry.
So how is that?
They've imported even more, I meant.
Imported even more. Right, yeah. So the naive idea is we put up trade barriers, right? And the trade barrier is essentially a tax on imported goods, to be blunt, right? That's all it is. So we tax imported goods, and hey, basic supply and demand, right? People will shift out of imported goods, and they'll buy more domestic goods. right? That's the naive argument. So what's wrong with that, and why do we get this surprising effect?
Right. So basically, this whole argument is that there are other things that are causing this imbalance of trade between the US and China, other than just free trade, right? Because, of course, you're restricting free trade by implementing tariffs, and that hasn't worked. If anything, it's made it worse. And so there are lots of potential reasons for this, and we can talk about some of the others later, I guess. But with this one, they're specifically blaming it on deficit spending and budget deficits in the US. So this is a very anti-Keynesian argument here. And the theory is, it's quite complicated, but I'll try and keep it really simple. Basically, the theory is that if you increase your budget deficit, so this means that your government is spending more than they're producing in revenues, then the result of this is that, and this is assuming that household savings don't rise and that private investment doesn't fall, which tends to happen when the government spends more, which is the whole reason why the Keynesians advocate for deficit spending. But the long-term effect of this is that it means that people begin to actually increase the amount that they import rather than increase the amount they export. And the reason for this is that, one, if you're reducing savings, people are just going to buy more. And of course, there is a whole global market. But there's this whole interest rate pressure sort of idea, which is that, so you begin deficit spending, and at first interest rates will fall. And this, of course, reduces savings. But then after a while, the interest rates will slowly increase, right? And this is because of the pressure that there is on banks to raise them due to the amount of consumption and the increased amount of malinvestment in the economy. So this is all explained in the Austrian business cycle theory, right? So the long run effect is that interest rates actually start to increase. And as they do this, it encourages capital investment from abroad, because of course people then, if your interest rates are increasing, more people want to save in the banks. And so a lot of people who are from abroad who want to invest in your country want to do so in the local currency in order to save in these banks, usually big millionaires and things from big corporations. And as more people are then changing to your local currency, you get a currency appreciation. And we know that as your currency appreciates, you increase your imports and you decrease your exports. And so the long run effect of maintaining a budget deficit is that you increase your trade deficit.
So what you're saying is, one aspect of what you're saying is that there's a disjointedness between, there can be a disjointedness between tariffs and imports, because imports can be more related to deficit spending.
Yeah, what I'm basically saying is that we cannot blame the trade deficit, which is at the heart of all of this, really. We can't blame the trade deficit on free trade, because as this recent experiment has shown, the deficit is caused more by the budget deficit than by simply open borders and a lack of tariffs, because the US has put in tariffs, but the trade deficit has got worse. So there's a negative correlation there. And so basically, you're not going to solve this issue just by instituting tariffs. You need to go a step further and solve a lot of the other domestic issues, which include reducing your deficit spending and a whole bunch of other things. And this is it's all very similar. But if you take my position, it's this whole Keynesian attitude of consumerism, which I think is all tied around this need to boost aggregate demand within the economy. So the Keynesians very much believe that the way to avoid a recession is to boost aggregate demand, which necessitates increased expenditure. And so it increases the budget deficit, which severely impacts your trade deficits. And so the root of this, I'm essentially saying, is that this is Keynesian consumerism that's caused this. It's not free trade. And so we're trying to limit free trade through tariffs is not going to solve anything. You're just going to make it more expensive for people to purchase things. So that's the argument we've got here anyway.
Very interesting. Okay, so I do want to jump to responding. I think I haven't been watching it carefully, but I think we have a lot to address in the comments. I did want to very briefly, this is not a political show per se. I did want to very briefly address the Chinese communist thing. And just share my own perspective, which is that I don't perceive China to be communist. That could be confusing for some people because they call themselves communist. But as Thomas Sowell taught us, you can't trust what things are named. The example he loved was the name of the act that gave Hitler dictatorial power. And it was named, Act for the Preservation and Flourishing of the Reich or something. You know what I mean? And as he pointed out, this act ultimately resulted in Germany being reduced to rubble. And similarly, another example in my own lifetime would be the Patriot Act, which I view as hugely unpatriotic in its effects on our freedoms. So, point is, simply because China still calls itself communist, Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978, and there were major changes immediately, as I understand it. Is that your understanding, Jack?
Yep.
I don't know how much. Yeah, major changes right away in 1978. So that is 42 years ago now. 42 years is longer than China was under Mao. The period of Mao was what, from I guess officially 1947, 48, something like that, up to 78 would be like the classic communist period. That was about 30 years. Well, it's been 42 years since that. So I don't think they remain communist in name, but the way China functions is not very much in any way that I can recognize as an economist, communist. Now, maybe there's, communist propaganda and stuff like this, but in terms of just, do they have a communist economy? Do they have something like, the Bolshevik economy that was put into place immediately after the Bolsheviks took over, say? Or do they have an economy something like during the Great Leap Forward period when so many died of starvation in China? I don't think so. But Jack, I welcome your perspective on this.
Yeah, well, I think one of the areas where because everyone loves to look at China now and go, oh, it's a free market paradise. It's not quite as open as people think, especially at the top. When companies get to a certain size, I can't remember what the exact levels are. When they get to a certain size, I think it's the law that the state then has to get involved with that company. Right. And so it's only really a free market on the medium and small sized businesses. As soon as they get to all the big Chinese corporations, they all have state interference. In most cases, they're state owned.
Right. And so, right. Yeah. And I don't mean, when I say that I don't view them as, a classically communist economy, I don't mean that they're a free market paradise either. I didn't.
Yeah.
All over the world. The other side. I completely recognize that, like we talked about back in the 90s or whatever, 80s, how far back was it, when Japan was viewed as like this great, they had found a new way, big business and big government working together, and then it all, they went into a depression forever. In a similar fashion, China, as we've discussed on the show, has huge structural problems in their economy. And I think we are going to see that. We're going to see a bubble burst in China, and it's going to be painful for them and for us. But I don't think it's all a bubble, and I don't think it's all an illusion. There is a real economy going on over there in China. They really produce. They've got a lot of waste and a lot of state involvement, just like we do, to be frank, that makes it not what it could be. So, it's a mixed economy, like basically what we have around the world.
And just to go a bit further on China's kind of economic evolution, this is another argument against what a lot of people are saying about limiting China. Is most people point the finger at China and go, look, they're this massive industrial powerhouse. We should be scared that they control so much of the world's economy here. But this is actually slowly falling apart in China. Because their GDP is not as high as it once was. This is their new normal. It's this slow decline in the level that GDP is increasing. And this is reflecting a whole combination of factors, but essentially, as well as their aging population, which of course is something to keep in mind, as China is getting wealthier, they're getting a growing middle class. And so you get more and more people who are able to afford to work in non-industrial areas. And then the way that the economy in China is shifting is that more companies are starting up to provide for the middle class rather than to become industrial powerhouses. And on top of this, you have the fact that you have rising living standards and rising labor costs due to this increase in wealth, which means that it's less attractive for foreign companies to set up there. I think right now the two countries that are really attractive are Vietnam and Myanmar. And so these are the two rising countries in Asia.
Right. And we've discussed this on a previous show. Some people need to update. If you haven't been paying attention, you need to update what you remember from when you were younger, when China was having these phenomenal growth rates every year, 9%, 10%, 11% growth. Everybody wanted to move their manufacturing there. That's not last year. That's 10 years ago, right, Jack? I mean, this is like ancient history at this point. China has not been growing at those phenomenal years now. And they aren't the magnet for exporting your manufacturing business to that they once were. That's all changed some time ago at this point.
Yeah, and so the fundamental lesson here is because from what I see, I think a lot of people are worried about China because they see China as a foreign state, as this big threat, and they're constantly on the up, and eventually they'll overtake the US and they'll become this new superpower. But I mean, you can already see the end of their economic growth on the horizon with the rise of these other countries. And so the lesson is that you can't fixate on just one country like this because you think that they're going to be the next big thing, because capital isn't like that. It's not static. It moves around. As things get more expensive and as countries increase their standards of living, it becomes far less attractive to invest there from an industrial perspective.
Right. So the picture I have in my head is, I think the picture some people have in their head, as you described, is like China's like a rocket and it's just shooting up and it's just going to buy everything up and take everything over. The picture I have in my head is China is becoming a normal economy. What we think in our modern blessed era, we think of as a normal economy. So they're not shooting up like a rocket. They're asymptotically approaching being like, Europe or the United States or something like that, right? With a middle class, regular rates of growth, 2 or 3% per year instead of 12%, right? And plenty of stuff they want to do for their own people, and it's not all just about exporting everything to the rest of the world. So they were not normal. That is very fair to say. For a couple decades there, it was amazing to watch. It was very strange. It was in a weird mode of basically joining the rest of the world after it had been shut off for centuries, really, right? It was in a very strange mode, and it's coming out of that mode, and it's just becoming another country in the world that's part of the International Division of Labor. That's really the better way to view it. Agreed, Jack?
Yeah, I agree. And I think it fundamentally touches on the point that I think is at the heart of this, and I think that the thing that's at the core of why free trade is a good thing. It's that it's not about which country is wealthier than the other. It's about the ability for capital and commodities to move freely around where supply and demand requires them to do so. And any sort of restriction that you're putting on a country that inhibits their ability for commodities or for capital or for labor to respond to global supply and demand chains is the same as if you was to do it on a micro level within a small community. It's the exact same argument you give to placing any sort of restriction on any market. It's just on a much bigger level.
Let's go to some comments. I'm going to start with one just because it directly addresses what we were talking about. Academic Agent says, Ding, as in Deng Xiaoping, discovered capitalism within communism, which I think he's just saying that, echoing what I was saying, right? Which is that within a sort of a nominal communism. They created capitalism inside it, in essence, right? That's how they pulled it off. Okay, so we have an incredible amount of. Oh, did some of them scroll off? I've never seen that happen before. 443. Oh my goodness. I don't think I have all the comments. When did this happen? I'm used to seeing everything. Maybe we just have more comments than normal. Okay, wow. Well, we'll catch the last 20 minutes of them. Let's see. Well, that's a bummer. Okay. Sorry, trying to find a substantive comment to... Oh, okay, here we go. Okay, I overestimated. 20%, Maven Politics says. China's about 20% of the world's population, 1.4 billion out of 7. Where did I get 2 in my head? Anyway, he's probably right. Okay, let's see. Australia is being hard with China politically, yet is a massive material exporter to China. I do not know as much about the foreign policy relationship, so to speak, between Australia and China, so I can't speak to that. Mad Merck could help us on that one. Academic Agent, the global economy is a Ponzi scheme to supply cement to make commie bridges.
It's technically correct.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say commie, I'd say more Keynesian, which I guess some people could call commie, but certainly with that cement, most of it will be going to these big infrastructural projects funded by the Chinese state. Yeah,
which are kind of like make-work projects or something, effectively, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, Lawrence Tim says most of the construction in China isn't market-demanded construction, though, is it? It's just building bridges and roads to keep people busy. That's been our strong impression. And, of course, that's going to fall apart.
Yeah, but I mean, fundamentally, to address this point, we're not sat here and arguing that China should be allowed to just keep bringing in whatever goods they need to do. We're saying that the market should be left for supply and demand to act in its natural way and allow resources to move where they want. And so you can't make the argument that China has an artificial demand for certain materials, and so the response should be to impose tariffs, because that's the logic doesn't add up there. You're replacing one form of artificial supply and demand with another form of artificial supply and demand through artificial scarcity through regulations. So yeah, the logic there doesn't add up. We're not saying that we're not in favor of artificial demand for things.
Lux at Lex says, I wonder how much of it is they can't grow all their food and how much is it that they don't trust their own food. Very funny. I seem to remember hearing about baby formula that was poisoned and had the people in China pretty freaked out. Let's see. People often pay premium in China for foreign grown food. Well, that's interesting. But I think that may be part of it, but I think the bigger picture is what we highlighted earlier, which is that they just don't have a lot of arable land and they got a lot of people to feed. Let's see, Lawrence, Tim, they build ghost towns, so a lot of these commodities are being used in places where they shouldn't be. Agreed. Interesting. China has one of the world's largest strategic oil reserves.
Yeah, well, that explains why the global demand for it is so much smaller than all the other materials. Clearly, they have their own. They just don't export it so much.
Where the Uyghurs, I think that's how you pronounce that. P-Man says, where the Uyghurs live has a lot of oil.
So over in the West.
And then Right Honorable Fez says China buys a lot of its oil from Iran. That would make sense. Okay, they do not have private rights. Lumberg says they do not have property rights and the rule of law. These are requirements for private investment and innovation, which lead to productivity gains. With these, they could easily be self-sufficient. Well, I don't think that's true in regards to food, but your point's taken. They're very wasteful right now because of the involvement of their government in their economy, and they could be a lot more efficient. I agree with that. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say they don't have property rights and the rule of law, but I'm not an expert on this. Do you have any insight on that one, Jack?
No, I tend to look more at the economic side of things than that. But
Yeah, it would be
I think
interesting to understand that better.
certainly it's not the same as Western property rights or law. I think that part is obvious.
Yeah, yeah. Idle Time says, how much will the bursting of the Chinese construction bubble affect the rest of the global economy? Well, we've discussed this on a previous stream, but basically, it's is there going to be a hard landing or a soft landing? That's the question. If China really has a depression and lots of people are thrown out of work, I mean, picture like the Great Depression in the United States and the Western world in the 30s, but in China, where they really get knocked back for 10 years or something. I think we would all feel it. It's fair to say.
Yeah, I think this kind of hits at a more broad point that we're trying to address in this stream, which is not only is there this apparent reliance on China, there's also the fact that if things go wrong in China, everyone else feels it. I think the solution to this isn't for everyone to lock themselves away. It's to deregulate the mobility of capital. Because we know that when one country begins to struggle, assuming that there aren't regulations in place that would limit where supply and demand allows for capital to flow, then other places will respond to this sudden increase in demand in order to make a profit. And so long as this is able to happen on a global level, then it doesn't matter so much if a country goes into a crisis, because there will be a new demand somewhere else.
Right, because what we don't want, I don't want depression in China. I wish the Chinese people the best. But what we really don't want is a depression in China to become a worldwide depression, which is pretty much what happened in the 30s, right?
Right.
Let's not have the chain reaction this time, if at all possible. Okay, Maven Politic. China is the world's 4th largest oil producer and the 2nd largest consumer. Interesting. Let's see. I love how efficient this stream is, Lawrence says. I don't know what that means. Lots of talk about AA's book, now available for just £5 UK or $6 US. I edited it, so I don't mind shilling it a bit. Okay, let's see. P-Man, natural resources are a good explanation for why the Chinese Communist Party persecute Uyghurs in Xinjiang so much. Can't let this crucial oil-filled area become independent. Well, that's interesting. That would be then a parallel, perhaps, to the way the United States is always messing about in the Middle East, right? It doesn't. People say, blood for oil and all that, and I hear some right-wing people say, "Oh, that's just a leftist talking point," and I'm like, yeah, but I think it might be true.
Yeah.
The leftists aren't always wrong. Let's see. Yeah, 18%. Okay, Yiz the eunuch says, I understand Radliv's point about regression or dumbing down for nationalist-focused production, but I think we'd be healthier and last longer as a people if we do. Yeah, I think this is the thing that AA is talking about. If people are happier and more satisfied, they've got better communities and stuff like that because, yeah, anyway. I want to respond to that, but I'm not going to just yet, just this moment. Okay, idle time. If the argument is about long-run effects, why does the trade deficit not lag the budget deficit by more? It looks like I've left the picture up to talk about that.
Yeah, well, a lot of it depends on what you mean by long run. I mean, I'm using long run to say that it doesn't happen instantly. I mean, if you look closely at the graph, you'll see this is in years. And so while the gaps may look short, they're several months behind.
Right.
So that would be my explanation, is that it looks quite short, but it is long run if you consider long run to be in terms of months rather than days or weeks.
Yeah, I would say that being that I work in digital movement of financial information, shall we say, I am aware of just how fast information gets around. So the responsiveness of the modern economy to changes and shifts can be quite amazing, I think. And that's why you see the closeness on some of these things, on some of these indicators. Okay, let's see. A lot of people stopped investing in China, says Ajit B07. due to the amount of fraud and not being able to audit. That's interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, because I guess that's supposedly one of the reasons that, say England, maybe Holland before it, started doing so well, is that there were trusted institutions, trusted processes, right? Double entry bookkeeping, all these various pieces came together to create a system where someone could invest money and feel some confidence that it wasn't just being completely wasted for nothing, right? And I think China's made great strides, but it's probably fair to say that there's a lot of corruption, and not just the corruption that she uses to eliminate opponents, but actual real corruption.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay. Yiz says it's because the economy is like your set of ethics and morals. Globalism allows bad actors to be the jihadists in your economy without having to be physically present. I'm not going to try to unpack that one. Yiz says we are Europeans with Christianity as a base. The more we decrease that combination of ethics and ideas, the less the systems that work for us function, the more open we become to attack. China knows this and uses it against the West all the time, as it has for years. I'm not so conspiratorially based as that. In particular, I'd love your perspective on this, in fact, Jack, from what you've been hearing. But I heard this thing said that China culturally, if you forget the communist period, China culturally just has been a more insular focused as a culture, and it hasn't had this missionary drive to spread something around the world. So there's never at any point been a global Chinese empire, though there was, to be fair, China was in Korea many hundreds of years ago and so forth, right? But basically the argument was China just doesn't have that missionary spirit. That's, the phrase I love from the Clint Eastwood movie, ain't no end to doing good. As the Yankee soldier says. What's your perspective on that?
I don't know specifically about that spirit, but what I will say is the argument I've heard for China not expanding like the Europeans did is more to do with geography, and how geography meant that the Europeans were constantly at war, because European terrain is constantly, like, there's so many peninsulas, mountains, rivers and things that divided Europe up into lots of different states, and to the extent that nobody has conquered all of Europe, and the Europeans have been at war with each other for centuries. And so as a result, this has kind of created this constant necessity to fight, which when they began to expand for various reasons, including the fact that the Ottomans cut off the trade routes with China when they conquered the Byzantine Empire, this meant that they brought this attitude to the rest of the world. Whereas China isn't divided up in that way, because it doesn't have the same geographic terms. It's meant that China has been much more united than Europe for a much longer period. And so whilst China has had lots of wars, it simply hasn't been to the same scale as the Europeans in history. And so as a result, the lack of war has meant the lack of need to then expand and to conquer other places. That's the theory that I've heard. People can take that how they will.
Maven Politics, it was discovered slightly before Deng at the capitalism was discovered at the grassroots party level, compacts between farmers to be individualistic and pretend to follow party orders. Yeah, I've heard some stories along those lines. A story along those lines, they were like, hey, how are these farmers being so productive? And I thought it was pretty interesting. A story worth looking up. Lawrence says they don't enforce intellectual property laws, so that helps them a lot. I'm no fan of intellectual property, so I'm on China's side on that one. Idle Time says China is still a command economy, just not as much as before. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by a command economy. My inclination is to not agree with that statement, but we'd have to talk about what we mean, economically speaking, by a command economy. And the problem is that it becomes muddled, right? Because just as there isn't a pure, we I think there can be, but we haven't seen a pure free market economy. We think it isn't even possible to have a pure command economy. Everyone just dies nearly instantly if they try. And so you saw, for example, the new economic period, the NEP period, follow the war communism of the early Bolsheviks because they were starving to death. And so they decided to let a little capitalism come back in pretty quickly. I mean, it took several years, and then they were already compromising, So I don't think we've really seen a pure command economy. So I don't know. How much do you have to have the state involved to count it as a command economy? Hard to say.
Yeah, this is the great debate, and this is why you always get people on our side of things saying that, when there's any amount of government intervention, it's suddenly socialist. And then on the other side of the aisle, they have the exact opposite mantra that as soon as the state isn't involved in a sector, it's free market capitalism. And this is why there's no agreement, and it's really difficult to discuss these things.
It's Ayn Rand gone mad if it isn't full communism, right?
Yeah.
Academic Agent says, Jack is right. The state can take over at any time. I don't remember the context. Do you understand?
So that was me mentioning the fact that big Chinese industries are basically all tied to the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have some sort of, I'm wanting to use the phrase prima nocte or whatever. That's not quite right, but you know what I mean. They have a right to, it's like they're the landlord, and at any time they can just take the farm over or something, right?
Yeah, and one of the people who's been in the chat, P-Man, he's really, he's looked into this a lot. He's very aware on this. But within China, they have a kind of, I guess, sort of, the party is in every facet of society.
Yeah, actually, let me read this real quick. P-Man says, 100% correct. Most of the big corporations are private, but there's high up CCP members involved.
Yeah. So this is basically what I was going to say, that even if the state doesn't directly take control of a company, they will fill this company basically with party members. And they'll say that in order to get anywhere in society, you basically have to become a member of the party. And so the state, even if indirectly, has almost every big corporation in its pocket.
Right. And this, I don't know what to think of this as an economist, but this is making me think of like a mafia model, right?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of,
let us wet our beak. We gotta have a little finger in your pie. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was thinking of, I guess, kind of dynastic feudalism or something, and with the trade guilds and so on.
Right.
But yeah, mafia, basically any sort of historical movement you can think of where they have to control everything.
Going back a little, Lundberg says, if you guys haven't read it, Niall Ferguson, not the recently resigned Neil Ferguson, but Niall Ferguson's book, Ascent of Money, is very relevant and is a very interesting take on this, specifically Chimerica. Okay, I haven't read it. I don't know. Let's see. Okay, Maven Politic claims most Chinese companies only become as big as they are thanks to state bank financing. This comes with strict caveats. Okay, so this is, they talk about the commanding heights, right? So this is where the Chinese government would control a bank, and then through the bank, they would have control over the economy, right? Unlike us and our central banks, right? Let's see. Academic Agent says capital flight is a real. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
To go back to that last point. I mean, I don't want to make people too paranoid, but certainly when you look at the constantly expanding power of the Federal Reserve in the US, the Bank of England in the UK, all of these big central banks increasing their power over the industry with their low interest rates and with their constant quantitative easing, maybe if you would be paranoid, you'd think that this is where things are heading.
Right. Academic Agent says capital flight is a real thing also, hence buying Canada and Russia. Is he talking about Chinese money in Canada and Russia, maybe?
I don't know precisely what he means by that, but certainly you do add another point that's, I guess, worth bringing up when you talk about Chinese money. One of the other hindrances, if the US wanted to try and lock China out of global trade, is that China has a huge stronghold on the U.S. economy because of their U.S. foreign currency reserves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. We're a little afraid of what they could do to our economy.
Yeah.
Tom of Gulf City, not to mention Africa, asked Semiagog about the meddling there. Yeah, we have discussed that on previous streams about China's involvement in Africa, which is interesting, shall we say. Let's see, I'm going to try to move a little faster here. Oh, and then it jumps me forward. Stop it. Sorry. Okay. A lot of places have a boom in the Industrial Revolution. England, USA, Japan. Oh, that's interesting, that the Industrial Revolution coincides with a boom. Actually, you'd think I'd know that about the original Industrial Revolution in the UK and in England, and I don't know that, that whether there was a boom at that time. I'd actually like to know.
It makes sense because in order for there to be an industrial revolution, you need capital to be invested in industrial fields, which tends to coincide with a boom.
Charlemagne says, Jack made some good arguments. Maybe we shouldn't do a nuclear war with China. Coming back to my passion for peace and not mass murdering people, I'm right with you there, Charlemagne. Idle time. Radlib, at what point do you think there's a moral imperative as a Christian to avoid business with entities owned by those who seek to oppress Christians? Right. So this is an issue not just with China, but with Islam, where a lot of, if you go to Voice of the Martyrs, if you have any interest in persecuted Christians, you'll find that they do talk about China, but they talk a lot about the Muslim world. Not all of the Muslim world, but certain Muslim countries persecute Christians quite a bit, especially, of course, people who convert from Islam to Christianity, which is technically in Islam considered punishable by the death penalty. So is the thing to do to, cut trade ties with these countries and so on and so forth? My inclination is to say no. I think being hostile to these countries tends to have counterproductive effects. It has rally around the flag effects when you go after a country, right?
That was the big one.
They view the government as, the government's, we're rallying around the government because as Steve Turley likes to say, if my brother and I are fighting and then our cousins come over, we unite against our cousins, and then we and our cousins unite against the kids down the block, and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, the big example of that would be Saddam Hussein and all of the sanctions on Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. Right,
where they united around Saddam, even if they didn't particularly like him before that. The academic agent tells more of that story. There was one farm doing extraordinarily well. It was reported to Deng Xiaoping. Rather than punish them, he replicated what they did, which was to establish property rights. So yeah, it's a great story, actually. Let's see. We have such an active chat. I don't know if I can keep up. It's interesting. They're actually creating a shortage of sand. Only certain types of sand are suitable for structural cement. I'm working with companies trying to use more abundant sands in concrete. That I find personally very fascinating. Just the idea of a shortage of sand. I don't know, just because I spent so many hours walking up and down the beach in Florida, where my grandparents were and where I was born. It boggles the mind to talk. The phrase "shortage of sand," just like it's giving me cognitive dissonance, But thank you, Mr. Spoon. Very interesting. Let's see. Maven Politics says Deng Xiaoping once held up Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments at a university graduation ceremony and told everyone to read it. By the way, Theory of Moral Sentiments is a much better book than Wealth of Nations. So I'm with Deng Xiaoping on that one. Let's see. Okay, in some cases, Glenn Raymond says, you have to go into a lottery in order to purchase property in China. Also, if you own land, it only lasts 100 years rather than permanent ownership. Maven Politics says, yes, the CCP technically owns all land. So that sounds like a holdover. Yeah, that's what you were saying. It's basically communism becomes feudalism. The Communist Party just becomes the ultimate landholder, ultimate feudal lord over China or something, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Gutted, want Radlib to respond to that. Please hold a Radlib versus Yiz stream. Radlib versus Yiz, we're great friends. I don't know how to be versus, but anyway, they're talking about stuff and I can't keep up with all of it. So let me see if there's anything else I want to call out. Responding to some of our latter points, Glenn Raymond says China was always busy being at war with itself. Yeah, and I do gather there's a lot of emphasis in China. I remember in Chinese history, I remember the Boxer Rebellion, as we call it here. I forget what they call it in China. That evidently was quite a horrible event, and many, many people died. And so the desire for stability, political stability in China is very strong. And, we tend to think of it as like, oh, the state just wants to oppress us and stay in power. I think because of that history, it actually goes beyond just the people in power. The people of China don't want to go through that one again. And then they had communism and everything that happened with the Communist Revolution and the wars between the communists and the nationalists and Japan invasion. I think China has an appetite for a little period of peace in their lives, I gather. Anyway, did you want to comment there, sir?
Yeah, I mean, something else to add would also be that China, and this is coming from Alexei Maslov, who I mentioned earlier, who was an expert on this subject. His idea is that it's also somewhat philosophical. China, unlike the West, where we're more, loosely speaking, individualist, and everything's based on our own private property and everything, China, they're a much more social community. And so as a result, you do see this reflected in the way that the state operates there. And part of the reason why labor costs keep increasing is because of their social insurance they put in place.
I learned to address my Chinese coworkers correctly. And one day I asked, and I felt like such a dummy once I answered. I asked, well, you guys taught me to, actually I learned in college from a fellow Chinese student. I asked them how to say their name right. And they said, well, you put my family name first, and then the first name, you just run it together, And then decades later, I asked a Chinese coworker, well, wait, why do you do the family name first? And he says, because family comes before the individual in China. And I'm like, well, duh. I should have figured that out on my own, right? Maven Politics says China historically had no neighbors to conquer. They went right up to all their natural boundaries and were unable to cross the mountains to Korea or the sea to Japan. They tried. So there's some of that geographic part of the story, which you referenced as well, I think.
Yeah.
Let's see. Charlemagne says, Jack is very smart and tempers my fascist impulses. I think that's an important role for economists to play, in fact.
Yes.
Let's see. Chinese steel tech. Again, that's the intellectual property stuff that I don't tend to be very sympathetic with. Lux said, Lex, Chinese steal foreign tech, then overtake. The Chinese knockoff Segway became so big it bought the original. Huawei went from third rate to putting up 5G towers in first world countries. But, I remember when I was very young, the same story being told about Japan. Japan, they make these cheap copies and then they steal our ideas and then they overtake us. And soon Japan will rule everything, and then they had a crash. And that was the end of Japan as the big monster of the day. And they had to find a new enemy to freak out about, or someone to make into an enemy. Let's see. Count Elmsley, this includes large multinational companies that want to do business and have offices there. For example, Google, CCP technically have control of them there. That's interesting. So it isn't just the domestic companies that get that mafia, let me wet my beak. It's even foreign companies that have a large presence there. The Communist Party has to be involved in some fashion. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but very interesting. Okay, let's see. Luxet Lex, the old underground church in China was incredibly based. I'd love to hear more about that. As a Christian, I do find it very interesting to hear about the underground church there. If the government were in charge of the Sahara, there would be a shortage of sand. Didn't Friedman say that? I actually think I remember that from reading him. Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to get into that. I withdraw. Okay, I think we're there. Yiz says, thanks for the interaction, RadLib. I'm openly uneducated on these things. Just started learning a couple of years ago. I learned by tossing out ideas and seeing what smart people tell me. Well, I hope we can help. We all have so much to learn.
Yeah, I think just a really short summary of stuff that will help point Yiz in the right direction here, just based on the sort of interactions that were being had. This kind of globalism stuff that you keep seeing, I don't know how other people feel, but I see this as a Keynesian thing and not a free market thing. So this is because of the artificially high availability of credit and also the large amount of state subsidies and regulations which allow these large corporations to form and then go off around the world and start setting up elsewhere. And so this isn't what I would consider to be a result of the free market at all.
Mm-hmm. I want to do two last things, I think. Idle Time says, thanks for doing these streams, RedLib. You're welcome. Thanks, Jack, so much for joining today. And then wanted to close with this. Maven Politic, when I visited China last, their mobile payment systems were way better than the West. The idea that they're not creative is no longer true. Yeah, I've heard people say the Chinese just culturally aren't creative and stuff like that. And I'm like, I mean, let's leave aside post 1978 China for a minute and just consider the overseas Chinese and their long history of being, the Jews of Asia, as they've been called, the like Jewish folks in Europe. Wherever the Chinese went, they started businesses. They were entrepreneurial. Throughout Asia, they would often end up being, the ones who owned the business that the locals were working for, right? If that sounds familiar to you from how it's been with Jewish people in Europe. So the overseas Chinese have long been talented. And I just have trouble believing that it's only the ones who leave China who have these entrepreneurial skills. That just, I'm not saying it's impossible. It just seems really, really unlikely. I have a little trouble believing that. Okay, so any last thoughts or comments you want to make, Jack, before we wrap up?
No, just thank you for letting me come on the stream. It's been a lot of fun. I feel like we've managed to talk about some really good points. Maybe sometime I'll be able to have you over on my channel as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and let me be frank. I and Jack knows this. I just was like, boy, it'd be great if somebody talked about this, but I had no idea how to approach the subject. So Jack really, really helped bring some substance to what we talked about today. And then I just wanted to highlight, because I'm still pretty happy about it, and it happened since the last time we've had a show. Lumberg said, RadLib, congrats on hitting 1,000 subscriptions on YouTube, subscribers on YouTube. And that indeed happened last week, I think. Jack can say the same thing. We both benefited from Academic Agent having us on a stream and really encouraging everybody to subscribe, right?
Yep. Yeah, my channel prior to AA stream was on just over 100 subscribers, and since the stream, I'm just below 500 now. Basically, that was because of that stream. So,
wow, that's fabulous. Okay, well, thanks, Academic Agent. I think you might be wrong on classical liberalism in one country, but we appreciate your support and your friendship. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Jack.